Lancaster stood in front of Jake with his arms crossed and looked at him with those sharp, calculating eyes that rich people always seem to have. He spoke in a casual way, but his voice had weight to it, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who was used to people listening when he talked. He told Jake that he was quite good at translating and then asked what his name was. Jake answered politely, telling the billionaire his name was Jake Cooper. He added the word sir at the end because that was what you did when you talked to people who had power over your paycheck. Lancaster tilted his head slightly like he was thinking about something. He said the name Cooper sounded familiar and asked if Jake had been in the news a few years back. He said something about Jake being some kind of genius with languages. Jake felt his jaw get tight and his teeth clenched together. Yes, he had worked with the diplomatic corps, he admitted. That was back when things were different, back when he had a future that looked bright instead of desperate. The billionaire's lips curved into a smile, but his eyes stayed cold and measuring. He said he remembered now and then asked why Jake had quit that job. Why would anyone walk away from that kind of important position, he wanted to know. Jake understood what Lancaster was really asking. The rich man wanted to know why Jake had thrown away such a good opportunity. Why was he sitting here as a cheap contractor instead of being respected as a chief translator at the Big Earth Embassy, where all the important people worked? Jake gave him a short answer, just saying it was for personal reasons. He did not want to explain his whole sad story to this stranger, even if that stranger was one of the richest men alive. Lancaster stared at him for a moment longer, and then walked away to rejoin his team. The break ended, and they all went back to the negotiation table. Jake pushed his uncomfortable feelings down and focused on his work again. Feelings did not pay medical bills. The rest of the meeting went smoothly. Jake translated every word perfectly, catching all the subtle meanings and cultural nuances that could make or break a deal like this. The Varathians wanted certain guarantees about how the mining would be done. Lancaster wanted certain protections for his investment. Back and forth they went, negotiating and compromising until finally they reached an agreement that both sides could accept. It took several more hours, but eventually they shook hands, or whatever the Varathian equivalent was, and the deal was done. Jake started packing up his tablet and his notes. He was exhausted and his throat hurt from talking for so many hours. But he felt satisfied because he had done good work and soon he would get his 5,000 credits. That money would keep his mother's treatment going, and that was all that mattered. He could rest later. Maybe he would even sleep for a whole 8 hours if he was lucky. As he was about to leave, Lancaster called out to him. The billionaire wanted him to wait a moment. Jake turned around and saw that the conference room had emptied out except for Lancaster and one of his advisors. Everyone else had left to celebrate the successful deal or whatever it was that rich people and aliens did after closing a $1 billion credit agreement. Lancaster walked closer, and his expression was serious now. He said he had meant what he said earlier about Jake being talented. Then he asked directly why Jake was wasting his abilities on contract work. He said he could use someone with Jake's skills in his organization, and he would pay 10 times what Jake had earned today. 10 times 5,000 was 50,000 credits. That much money could cover his mother's treatment for more than a month and maybe even let him save some for the future. For just a second, Jake let himself imagine what that would be like. Having enough money, not worrying every single day about whether his mother would get her medicine, being able to sleep at night without nightmares about medical bills. But then reality came crashing back down on him like a heavy weight. A full-time job meant regular hours and a set schedule. It meant he could not take multiple jobs in a single day. It meant less total money even if the individual job paid more. Jake thanked Lancaster for the offer but said he could not commit to a full-time position. He explained that he needed the flexibility of contract work. Lancaster's friendly expression changed and became harder. His voice got an edge to it. He said that flexibility was an interesting word for what Jake was doing. He said that from what he had heard, Jake took every garbage job that came his way and was basically working himself to death for almost no money. Jake felt defensive and said his circumstances were complicated. Lancaster stepped even closer and his voice dropped lower, becoming almost intense. He told Jake to uncomplicate them then. He said he did not know what kind of hole Jake had dug himself into, but whatever debt he was carrying or whatever trouble he was running from, Lancaster could help. His legal team could handle almost anything, he claimed. That made Jake angry. Of course, the billionaire assumed it was about debt or crime or some stupid mistake Jake had made. Rich people always thought that way. They thought every problem could be solved by throwing money at it or by getting lawyers involved. They could not imagine that some situations were just hard and unfair, and could not be fixed with a checkbook. Jake's voice came out tight and controlled when he spoke. He said it was not about debt. It was about his mother. She had Bennington disease, a terrible sickness that was slowly killing her. The experimental treatment she needed cost more money than Jake could possibly make in a normal job, but if he took a salaried position, he would lose the ability to work multiple jobs every day. Contract work let him take 5 or sometimes even 6 different jobs in a single day. It was the only way he could earn enough to keep up with her massive medical bills. Lancaster stared at him and did not say anything for a long moment. Then, to Jake's complete shock and confusion, the billionaire started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly, but it was loud and it echoed through the empty conference room. Jake felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. He said coldly that he was glad Lancaster found his situation so amusing. His mother was dying and this rich man thought it was funny. Lancaster held up one hand and was still chuckling a little bit. He said no, that was not why he was laughing at all. Then he asked Jake if he had any idea how ridiculous this whole situation was. Jake just stared at him, not understanding what the billionaire meant. What was ridiculous about a son trying desperately to keep his mother alive? What was funny about working yourself into the ground because the universe was cruel and medical care was expensive? Lancaster's expression started to soften a little bit. He explained what he found so ridiculous. Here was one of the most talented linguists in all of human space, killing himself with terrible low-paying jobs just to afford medical treatment for his mother. Meanwhile, Lancaster had just signed a deal worth 2 billion credits, and he was going to have to spend a big chunk of that money hiring inferior translators because the best translator in the system would not work for him. That was what was ridiculous, he said. Jake started to say again that he had explained why he could not take a salaried position, but Lancaster cut him off. The billionaire pulled out his personal tablet and told Jake to shut up and listen before refusing the offer. He said he was going to make Jake an offer and he wanted Jake to hear the whole thing before saying no. Jake's jaw was still tight with anger and confusion, but he nodded. He would listen even though he was sure this was going nowhere. Lancaster looked down at his tablet and started typing something. Then he looked back up at Jake and said that first, Jake's mother's medical bills were now paid. All of them. Past bills, current bills, and future bills. Lancaster was setting up a medical trust right now that would cover her treatment for the rest of her life, no matter how much it cost or how long she lived. Jake felt like the floor had disappeared under his feet. He said what in a voice that came out as barely a whisper. This could not be real. People did not just do things like this, but Lancaster was not done talking. He continued as if Jake had not said anything at all. Second, he said, Jake was going to come work for him, not as a contractor and not as some disposable translator who could be replaced, as his chief linguistic officer. Jake would be in charge of an entire department. His job would be to handle all translation and interpretation needs for Lancaster's company when they did business with alien species. It would be a real position with real authority and real respect. Jake sat in the corner of the dirty spaceport bar with his old tablet in front of him. His fingers moved fast across the screen as he worked on another translation job. This one was boring work, just changing some mining papers from one alien language to regular space talk that everyone could read. The job would give him barely enough money to buy food for one day. Around him in the bar, all kinds of strange aliens were doing business and talking in weird sounds that most humans could never understand. He was really good with languages. Not just good, he was amazing at it. Most humans had trouble learning even the basic space language that everyone used, but Jake could learn alien languages like it was easy. He was only 23 years old and he already knew how to speak 17 different alien languages perfectly. He could understand 5 more and knew enough of 12 others to get by. A skill like that should have made him rich, but instead of being rich, people just used him and paid him very little. His phone buzzed and he looked at it. It was a message from the place on Earth where his mother was getting medical care. The bill was late again and they wanted their money. His mother had a really bad sickness called Bennington disease and it did not care that Jake had no money. The special medicine she needed cost 30,000 credits every month and the government only paid for a small part of that. Jake had been barely making it work by taking every translation job he could find, even the bad ones that paid almost nothing. Jake closed his eyes and rubbed his head. He was tired and worried. His mother had given up everything to raise him by herself after his father died in the big war. She had worked 3 different jobs just to send him to school where he learned about his gift for languages. Now when she needed him the most, he could barely keep her alive. The thought made his chest hurt. A shadow fell across his table and Jake looked up. Standing there was a Zenthari merchant. The alien had 4 eyes and they were all looking at him in a way that might have been amusement or curiosity. Jake switched his brain to Zenthari language mode and spoke to the creature in its own tongue, asking if he could help. The alien made clicking sounds with its mouthparts and seemed surprised. It said that most humans could not speak the trade language and that Jake speaking it was very impressive. Then the alien said it had a job that needed someone who could keep secrets and who was good with languages. The alien wanted to know if Jake was interested. Jake pointed at the empty seat across from him. When you did the kind of work he did, you never said no to a chance to make money. He told the alien he was listening and ready to hear about the job. The Zenthari sat down and explained what it needed. There was going to be a big important business meeting between some Varathian miners and a group of rich humans. The meeting would decide if they would work together on a mining deal. The Zenthari needed someone to translate between them because the 2 groups spoke different languages. The alien said the job would pay 5,000 credits. 5,000 credits was a lot of money for Jake. That was almost enough to pay for his mother's medicine for a whole month. He tried not to look too excited because he did not want the alien to know how desperate he was. He asked when the meeting would happen, and the Zenthari told him it would be in 2 days at the fancy part of the spaceport up in the high levels. Jake agreed to do the job, and the alien gave him some information about where to go and when to be there. After the Zenthari left, Jake sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. 2 days to prepare, and then he would have enough money to keep his mother's treatment going for almost a month. It was not a permanent solution, but it would buy him time. He pulled up information on his tablet about Varathian language and culture. He already spoke Varathian pretty well, but he wanted to make sure he did not make any mistakes during the meeting. This job was too important to mess up. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Jake reviewed every technical term he might need for a mining negotiation. He practiced switching quickly between Varathian and English until he could do it without thinking. He barely slept, running on coffee and nervous energy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face and remembered how she used to smile before she got sick. That memory kept him going. On the morning of the meeting, Jake put on his only good shirt and tried to make himself look professional. He looked at himself in the mirror of his tiny room and saw a young man with dark circles under his eyes and worry lines that made him look older than 23. He looked tired and worn out, but at least his shirt was clean. He grabbed his tablet and headed to the upper levels of the spaceport. The difference between the lower levels where Jake worked and the upper levels where rich people did business was shocking. Down below, everything was dirty and broken and smelled bad. Up here, everything was clean and shiny. The floors were polished and the air smelled fresh. Through the big windows, Jake could see expensive private spaceships parked outside, gleaming in the artificial lights. This was a different world, one where people had enough money that they did not have to worry about medical bills or whether they could afford to eat. Jake found the conference room and walked in. It was a huge space with windows that showed a view of Earth below. The planet looked beautiful from up here, all blue and white and peaceful. Jake had not been home to Earth in 2 years. He could not afford the travel, and he needed to stay where the translation work was. The room had a big table and comfortable chairs, and everything looked expensive. The Varathians arrived first. There were 3 of them, and they were huge, much bigger than humans. Their skin was covered in scales that reflected the light in rainbow colors. They were reptile creatures, and they moved with a kind of grace despite their size. Their leader was named Krath Vor, and he nodded at Jake when he saw him. Jake greeted them in proper Varathian, using the formal words that showed respect. The aliens seemed pleased that he knew their language well. Then the human group walked in, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. Leading the group was Gregory Lancaster, one of the richest men in the whole solar system. Jake had seen his face in news reports and on advertisements. Lancaster had made his fortune by inventing new types of computer technology, and now he was worth billions of credits. Behind Lancaster were two people who worked for him and some security guards. Lancaster's eyes moved around the room like he was measuring everything and everyone. When his gaze landed on Jake sitting in the translator's chair, something changed in his expression. Jake could not tell if it was contempt or pity or something else. Rich people often looked at poor people that way, like they were trying to figure out what had gone wrong in their lives. Jake kept his face neutral and professional. He was here to do a job, not to be judged by billionaires. The meeting started and Jake began to translate. He switched between Varathian and English smoothly, making sure every word was accurate and every meaning was clear. The discussion was about mining rights in an asteroid belt that had valuable materials. The Varathians wanted human money and technology to help them mine it. Lancaster wanted to own most of the operation and keep most of the profits. It was the kind of business deal that rich people made all the time, fighting over who would get more money from rocks floating in space. Hours went by and Jake's throat got dry from talking so much, but he kept going. This was what he did. This was how he kept his mother alive. Every word he translated was another small step toward paying that huge medical bill. He could not afford to be tired or distracted. Finally, they took a break and Jake allowed himself to relax for a moment. That was when Lancaster walked over to him and everything changed. Jake spent every spare moment over the next few weeks preparing for the Caltharian negotiations. He immersed himself completely in their language and culture until he was dreaming in their organic patterns and biological metaphors. Caltharian was unlike any language he had ever learned before. It required thinking about concepts as living systems rather than fixed ideas. Everything was about growth and connection, and the flow of energy through networks. It was beautiful and complex and absolutely exhausting to study. The Calthari delegation arrived at the neutral space station 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Nobody knew why they came early, but Lancaster took it as a good sign. They were eager, which meant they actually wanted this deal to work. Jake was nervous as he prepared for the first meeting. Everything he had learned about the Calthari suggested they were difficult to communicate with and very particular about protocol. One wrong word or gesture could end the negotiations before they even started. When Jake first saw the Calthari, he understood immediately why so few humans managed to communicate with them successfully. They were not just alien in appearance. They were fundamentally different in ways that challenged human perception. Their bodies seemed to shift and change subtly, as if they existed in a constant state of biological transformation. Colors rippled across their skin in complex patterns, and Jake realized with a start that those colors were part of their communication system. The lead negotiator's name translated roughly to flows through networks. Jake approached carefully and spoke in Caltharian, using the proper greeting formula he had memorized. He said he greeted the pattern that sustained them, and hoped their exchange would grow fruitful branches. It was a formal and respectful greeting that acknowledged the Caltharian way of seeing the world as interconnected biological systems. The colors on flows through networks shifted to warm golden hues, and Jake knew from his studies that this indicated pleasure and approval. The Calthari responded by saying it was unexpected to find a human who spoke not just their words, but their concepts. They called it growth in barren soil, which Jake understood was an enormous compliment. Most humans who tried to learn Caltharian could repeat phrases, but they did not truly understand the underlying meaning. Jake had worked hard to think like a Calthari when he spoke their language, and it showed. The delegation seemed genuinely pleased and interested in continuing the conversation. Over the following weeks, Jake became the essential bridge between the two completely different civilizations. He did not just translate words from one language to another. He translated entire worldviews and ways of thinking. When the Calthari talked about trade in terms of symbiotic relationships and mutual growth, Jake helped Lancaster's team understand that these were not just nice metaphors. The Calthari literally viewed all forms of exchange as biological interactions between living systems. The negotiations were slow and careful. The Calthari were interested in sharing their advanced biotechnology, but they had concerns. They worried that humans would try to own and control the knowledge rather than allowing it to grow and spread naturally. This was a fundamental difference in philosophy. Humans thought in terms of ownership and profit. Calthari thought in terms of cultivation and shared benefit. Finding common ground between these two perspectives was incredibly difficult. The breakthrough came during a discussion about medical technology. The Kalthari had treatments that could cure diseases humans still struggled with. They had extended their own natural lifespans by centuries. They had organic computing systems that rivaled the best human quantum computers. But they were hesitant to share any of it because they feared humans would patent everything and prevent the knowledge from spreading freely. Jake could see the negotiations starting to fall apart, and he knew he had to do something. Without fully thinking it through, Jake started speaking. He told the Kalthari about his mother in their language, framing it in their terms. He explained that her pattern had been degrading and her cellular cascade was failing. Then he described how a human with resources had helped restore her to health, not for profit, but because he understood that some things transcended simple exchange. Jake said humans could learn from the Kalthari not to possess their knowledge, but to help it flourish in new soil. The room went completely silent. Every Kalthari in the delegation stopped moving, and their skin patterns began shifting through a complex array of colors. Jake recognized this from his studies as a sign of deep contemplation and serious consideration. He held his breath and hoped he had not just ruined everything by getting too personal, but he had spoken from his heart and in their language that seemed to matter more than careful diplomatic phrasing. Flows through networks leaned forward and addressed Jake directly. The Kalthari asked if Jake was speaking of a gift given freely, of growth encouraged without strangling control. They wanted to know if this human Lancaster truly understood the concept of symbiosis. Jake glanced at Lancaster, who gave him a small nod. The billionaire was trusting Jake to speak for him and to represent his intentions accurately. Jake chose his words carefully. He explained that Lancaster understood some investments had no immediate return, but made the entire ecosystem stronger in the long run. He said Lancaster had saved his mother's life and given him opportunity, not for what Jake could give him today, but for what they might build together in the future. It was an investment in potential and in relationship, rather than a simple transaction expecting immediate profit. The Kalthari's colors shifted to brilliant blues and greens. These were clear signs of approval and excitement that Jake had learned from his studies. He had said the right thing. More importantly, he had helped them see that at least some humans could understand their way of thinking. After that moment, the tone of the negotiations changed completely. The Kalthari became more open and willing to discuss specific possibilities for collaboration. The deal that eventually emerged was unlike anything the business world had seen before. The Kalthari agreed to share their biotechnology, but they insisted on a collaborative framework, rather than traditional corporate licensing. They proposed a joint research initiative where human and Kaltharian scientists would work side by side. All discoveries would be shared openly. Patents would be minimal and any resulting treatments would be made available at cost, rather than for maximum profit. When Lancaster presented this proposal to his board of directors, many of them were furious. They demanded to know where the profit protection was. Where was the competitive advantage? How were they supposed to make money if they gave everything away? This was not how business worked. This was not how you built shareholder value. Some board members threatened to resign if Lancaster went through with this insane plan. Lancaster listened to all their objections calmly. Then he stood up and said something that shocked everyone in the room. He said that 10 years from now, they could be richer than they were today, or they could be part of something that actually mattered. He was choosing the latter option, and if the board did not like it, they were welcome to leave. Several board members did resign, but most of them stayed, curious to see if this crazy experiment might actually work. The Collaborative Research Initiative was officially launched 6 months later. It was called the Cooperative Initiative for Mutual Advancement, or CIMA. Jake was present at the opening ceremony and watched as human and Kaltharian scientists met for the first time. There was nervousness on both sides, but also excitement and hope. The first joint project they decided to tackle was genetic disorders like Bennington disease, the illness that had almost killed Jake's mother. Within just 1 year, the joint team developed a cure. Not just a treatment that slowed the disease down, but an actual cure that eliminated it completely. The cost of this cure was a fraction of what the experimental treatment had been. Jake thought about all the families who would not have to go through what he went through. All the people who would not have to watch their loved ones suffer. All the desperate children who would not have to work themselves to exhaustion trying to keep their parents alive. Jake found himself at the center of SEMA operations. His role expanded beyond just translation. He became a liaison between human and Caltharian teams, helping them understand each other's ways of thinking and working. His ability to bridge the conceptual gap between species made him invaluable. Scientists from both sides would come to him when they hit communication barriers, and Jake would help them find common ground. But something else was happening that nobody had anticipated. Word was spreading through the galactic community about SEMA and what it represented. Other alien species were taking notice of this unusual collaboration between humans and Calthari. They were watching to see if it would work or if it would collapse into the usual competitive squabbling that characterized most interspecies relations. The galaxy was waiting to see if this new model was sustainable or just an interesting failure. 6 months after SEMA launched, the Varathians reached out to Lancaster. These were the same reptilian aliens from that first translation job Jake had done, the job where everything had started. They had advanced materials science knowledge, but they lacked biological expertise. Their mining operations were efficient, but environmentally. Jake's mind was spinning and he could barely process what he was hearing. He managed to say that he could not accept charity from anyone, especially not from a stranger he had just met a few hours ago. His pride was one of the few things he had left, and he was not ready to give it up, even for his mother. But Lancaster's expression changed and became sharp and almost angry. He said Jake was an idiot if he thought this was charity. This was business, pure and simple. The billionaire started explaining, and his words came fast and firm. He asked if Jake knew how much money bad translations had cost him over the years. Millions of credits, he said. Deals that fell through because translators did not understand cultural differences between species. Contracts that had loopholes in them because the translator missed important nuances in the language. Lancaster said he had watched how the Varathians reacted to Jake's work today, and they had trusted him completely. That kind of trust was worth more than gold in the business world. Jake's mind was still racing and trying to catch up. This seemed too good to be true, and when things seemed too good to be true, they usually were. There had to be a catch somewhere. He asked Lancaster why he was doing this. They had just met today, and Lancaster did not know anything about him. Why would a billionaire offer to pay for a stranger's mother's medical care and give him a high-level job? It made no sense. Lancaster was quiet for a moment, and his expression changed to something Jake could not quite read. When the billionaire spoke again, his voice was different. It was stripped of the usual confident tone and sounded more human, more vulnerable. He said that 20 years ago his daughter had gotten sick. It was a rare genetic disorder, and they had tried everything to save her. Lancaster had spent millions on treatments and experimental procedures. Nothing had worked. His daughter had died when she was only 12 years old. Jake felt all his anger and suspicion drain away and get replaced by a hollow ache in his chest. He knew that kind of pain, the helpless feeling of watching someone you love suffer and not being able to fix it. Lancaster continued talking and said he had all the money in the world back then, but it could not save his little girl. He said he learned something important from that experience. Money did not mean much if you could not use it to help the people you loved. The billionaire said yes, he was ruthless in business. He would crush his competitors and negotiate deals that left other people with nothing. But when he saw someone with real talent destroying themselves to save their family, someone who reminded him of what he could not do for his own daughter, he was going to help, not because he was a nice person, but because he had the power to help and because he could. If he could not save his own child, at least he could save someone else's mother. Jake did not know what to say. His throat felt tight and his eyes were burning. He had spent so long fighting alone, taking every terrible job, working until he collapsed from exhaustion, and now this stranger was offering to lift that crushing weight off his shoulders. It felt unreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. He finally managed to ask what Lancaster wanted in return. There had to be something. Nobody gave away this much without expecting something back. Lancaster smiled, and it was a real smile this time, not the calculating expression he wore during business negotiations. He said he wanted Jake to be the best chief linguistic officer in the solar system. He wanted Jake to build a department that would make other companies jealous. He wanted Jake to help him close deals that no one else could close, because Jake understood aliens better than anyone else. That was what he wanted in return, for Jake to be brilliant and successful instead of wasted and exhausted. Jake took a shaky breath and nodded. He said he would do it. He would take the job and he would be the best at it that he could possibly be. Lancaster nodded back and held out his hand. They shook on it, and in that moment, Jake's entire life changed direction. No more desperate scrambling for contract work. No more choosing between food and medicine. No more waking up in the middle of the night terrified that he would not make enough money this month. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Lancaster's legal team set up the medical trust exactly as promised. Jake watched in amazement as all his mother's bills got paid off, and the hospital called to confirm that her treatment was fully covered going forward. He talked to her on a video call and told her what had happened. She cried and he cried, and for the first time in years, those tears were from happiness instead of despair and fear. Jake moved into a small but clean apartment near Lancaster Industries headquarters. It was nothing fancy, but compared to the tiny room he had been living in, it felt like a palace. He had a real bed and a kitchen and windows that looked out at something other than a dirty alley. He went shopping for new clothes because his one good shirt was not enough for a professional job. He bought 5 shirts and 2 pairs of pants and felt ridiculously wealthy. His first day at Lancaster Industries was intimidating. The building was huge and modern and filled with important-looking people doing important things. Jake was introduced to the team he would be working with and given an office that had his name on the door. His name on a door. He sat in his new chair and looked at his new desk and his new computer, and had to pinch himself to make sure this was really happening. Lancaster called him into a meeting on his second day. The billionaire wanted to discuss building up the linguistics department. He said Jake had a blank check within reason to hire whoever he needed. Jake should look for people with real talent, people like himself who had the gift for languages. Build a team of the best translators in human space, Lancaster told him. Money was no object as long as they were worth it. Over the next 3 months, Jake did exactly that. He reached out to people he had worked with before, talented translators who were being wasted on low-paying contract work, just like he had been. He offered them good salaries and real positions, and every single one of them accepted. Soon he had a team of 15 exceptional linguists, each one bringing their own unique skills and knowledge. Together they could handle 40 different alien languages and countless dialects. But the best part was not the job or the money, or the respect that came with his new position. The best part was his mother. The experimental treatment was working. Her Bennington disease went into remission and she started getting better. Her color came back and she could walk without getting tired. She started smiling again, really smiling, with light in her eyes that Jake had not seen in years. When she visited him at his new apartment, she hugged him so tight he thought his ribs might crack. She whispered thank you over and over into his shoulder while she cried. But Jake knew who to really thank. Lancaster had done this. The billionaire had taken a chance on a desperate translator and changed 2 lives completely. Jake promised himself he would prove that Lancaster's faith in him was not misplaced. He would work harder than he had ever worked before, not because he was desperate now, but because he was grateful. One evening, Lancaster invited Jake to have dinner with him. Not a business dinner, but just 2 people sharing a meal. They sat in a quiet restaurant on the orbital station and talked about things that had nothing to do with work. Lancaster told stories about his daughter, sharing memories that clearly still hurt but that he wanted to keep alive. Jake listened and understood that this was the billionaire's way of explaining why he had helped. He saw his daughter in Jake's mother, another person who deserved to live but might not get the chance. Jake thanked Lancaster again, but the billionaire waved it off. He said Jake was earning his keep and then some. The linguistics department was already making a difference in negotiations. Other companies were taking notice and wanting to know who Lancaster's secret weapon was. Jake had handled 3 major translations in the past month, and each one had gone perfectly. Lancaster said he was getting exactly what he paid for, which was excellence. As they finished dinner, Lancaster mentioned something interesting. He had been contacted by the Kalthari Trade Ministry. The Kalthari were one of the most reclusive alien species in known space. They rarely talked to outsiders, and when they did, it was usually brief and formal. but now they were expressing interest in opening trade negotiations with humans. Lancaster wanted to know if Jake had ever studied Caltharian language. Jake admitted that he had been studying it on his own time. Caltharian was incredibly difficult and fascinating. It was not just a language, it was a completely different way of thinking. The Calthari thought in terms of biological systems and organic patterns. Their language reflected that. Most human translators could not even begin to grasp it. But Jake had always loved a challenge, and the complexity of Caltharian called to him like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Lancaster smiled and said he knew Jake had been studying it. He had seen the linguistics books on Jake's desk. He said the preliminary negotiations with the Calthari would start next month, and he wanted Jake there. Not just as a translator, but as a full member of the negotiating team. Jake's insights into how the Calthari thought would be invaluable. This was going to be the biggest deal Lancaster Industries had ever attempted, and Jake would be right at the center of it. Lancaster accepted the Varathian request, and they became the second species to join SEMA. Jake found himself translating again for the same aliens from that first job, but everything was different now. He was not a desperate contractor anymore. He was a respected professional, helping to build something important. The Varathians remembered him and seemed pleased that the human translator they had trusted before was still involved in this new initiative. Trust was everything in business, and Jake had earned theirs. Then came the Zenthari, the insect-like species whose broker had first hired Jake for that fateful translation job. They offered their expertise in energy systems and renewable power generation. They had been watching SEMA's progress and wanted to be part of it. After them came the Draxians with their gravitational manipulation technologies. Then species Jake had never even heard of started making contact, drawn by whispers of something unprecedented happening in human space. Within 3 years of that first deal between humans and Calthari, SEMA had grown to include 37 different species. Each one brought unique knowledge and capabilities to share. Caltharian biologists worked alongside Varathian materials experts. Zenthari energy specialists collaborated with human quantum computer engineers. Draxian gravity technicians helped Calthari develop new medical scanning devices. The sharing of knowledge was creating breakthroughs that would have taken centuries to achieve if each species had worked alone. Jake stood in the observation deck of Siam's new headquarters one evening, looking out at the massive space station that had been built to house all the collaborative research. Behind him, in hundreds of specialized laboratories, beings from dozens of worlds worked together on projects that would benefit everyone. It was incredible to think that all of this had started because a desperate translator had gotten help from a wealthy businessman. One act of kindness had created ripples that spread across the entire galaxy. Lancaster came to stand beside him at the window. The billionaire looked older now, but there was satisfaction in his expression. He said something that surprised Jake. He mentioned that he had made more money in the past 3 years than in the previous 20 years combined. It turned out that when you helped everyone advance together, there was plenty of profit to go around for everybody. The competitive model where only one winner took everything was actually less profitable than the collaborative model where everyone won. Jake smiled and asked if that was why Lancaster had done it. For the money. Lancaster laughed and said no, of course not. He had done it because Jake was right about some investments mattering more than immediate returns. But the financial success was definitely a nice bonus that made the board of directors much happier. Several of the board members who had resigned in protest had tried to come back when they saw how profitable SEMA was becoming. Lancaster had refused to take them back. Lancaster mentioned that Jake's mother had visited the station last week. Jake said yes, she had told him about the visit. Lancaster revealed that she had wanted to thank him personally for everything he had done. He said Jake's mother had told him something interesting. She said Lancaster had saved her son as much as he had saved her. She explained that working yourself to death for someone you love is not really living. It is just slowly dying in a different way. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. He thought about those desperate days in the dirty cantina, taking any job no matter how degrading or poorly paid. He had thought he was being noble and self-sacrificing for his mother. But she was right. He had been slowly destroying himself, and that would have hurt her just as much as her disease hurt him. She did not want him to kill himself trying to save her. She wanted him to live a real life. Jake told Lancaster thank you again for everything, for his mother's life and for his own life too. Lancaster just nodded and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars. Down below them on the station, scientists were curing diseases and developing new technologies and learning to understand species they had feared or ignored before. It was beautiful, and it was all built on a foundation of choosing cooperation over competition. The success of SEMA was forcing the major galactic powers to reconsider how species interacted with each other. For centuries, interstellar relations had been defined by careful trade agreements, territorial disputes, and a general sense that every species was competing against every other species. Everyone hoarded their knowledge and technology, viewing them as advantages that needed to be protected from others. But SEMA was proving that a different approach was not just possible, but actually better for everyone involved. Humanity, despite being relative newcomers to the galactic community, was suddenly at the center of this transformation. Other species were looking to humans not for military might or technological superiority, but for diplomatic vision. The ability to see beyond immediate self-interest and build long-term collaborative frameworks. It was a strange position for humanity to be in, but Jake thought they were rising to the challenge pretty well. Representatives from the Galactic Assembly reached out to Lancaster requesting a meeting. They wanted to discuss expanding the SEMA model into a larger framework that could include even more species. They were talking about creating a council for interspecies cooperation that would formalize these collaborative relationships and create structures to support them. It would be the biggest change to galactic politics in recorded history. Lancaster asked Jake if he would be willing to serve as humanity's representative to this new council. Jake was shocked by the request. He was just a translator who had gotten lucky. But Lancaster explained that Jake was much more than that. He understood how different species thought and communicated. He had personal relationships with key figures in dozens of alien governments. He had proven he could bridge gaps that others thought were unbridgeable. There was nobody better qualified for the position. Jake was hesitant at first. This was a huge responsibility, and he was not sure he was ready for it. But then he thought about everything that had happened over the past few years. He had gone from desperate and alone to successful and supported. His mother had gone from dying to healthy. SEMA had gone from a crazy idea to a galactic movement. All of that had happened because people took chances and tried new things even when they were scared. Maybe it was his turn to take that kind of chance. Jake accepted the position and spent the next several months preparing for his new role. He studied galactic law and political structures. He met with representatives from dozens of species to understand their concerns and priorities. He worked with human diplomats to develop Earth's official positions on various interspecies issues. It was exhausting but also exhilarating. He was helping to shape the future of galactic civilization, and that was incredible. His mother attended his official swearing-in ceremony. She sat in the front row with tears of pride running down her face. After the ceremony, she hugged him and said his father would have been so proud. Jake hugged her back and thought about how different things were now, compared to just a few years ago. Back then, he had been fighting just to keep her alive for another month. Now she was healthy, and he was about to become one of the most important diplomats in human space. At the first major session of the new
Council for Interspecies Cooperation was scheduled
to take place on a neutral station. Representatives from over 50 species would be attending. Jake would be giving the opening address on behalf of humanity. He spent weeks preparing his speech, writing and rewriting it until every word felt right. This was his chance to explain what humanity brought to the galactic community, and he wanted to get it exactly right. The night before the big session, Jake could not sleep. He kept thinking about that day in the cantina when the Zenthari broker had offered him a simple translation job. If he had turned it down, if he had been too tired or too discouraged to take one more job that day, none of this would have happened. His mother might be dead. SEMA would not exist. The council would not be forming. Everything that mattered had come from that one decision to keep trying, even when things seemed hopeless. Lancaster called him that night to wish him luck. The billionaire said he knew Jake would do great, and that he should just speak from the heart. Jake thanked him and said he would try his best. After they hung up, Jake looked at his speech one more time. He had prepared formal remarks about technical details and policy frameworks. But as he read through them, he realized that was not what people needed to hear. They needed to hear the story of how all this started. They needed to understand the human element behind the political structures. Jake made a decision. He would tell his story. He would explain how a desperate translator had received help from a stranger, and how that simple act of generosity had created ripples that changed the galaxy. He would make them understand that cooperation was not just good policy. It was the right thing to do, not because it was profitable, though it turned out to be. Not because it was strategic, though it was, but because it reflected the best of what any species could be. The morning of the council session arrived. Jake dressed carefully in formal diplomatic attire and made his way to the assembly hall. The room was enormous and filled with beings from across known space. Jake began his speech by speaking in Galactic Common, but he made sure his words carried emotional weight that went beyond simple translation. He told the assembled representatives that 10 years ago, he had been sitting in a dirty cantina, desperate and exhausted. He had been trying to earn enough money to keep his mother alive one more month. He had thought he was alone in his struggle and that the universe was simply a place where you either had resources or you did not. If you did not have them, you were just unlucky and there was nothing anyone could do about it. He switched briefly to Caltharian, knowing they would appreciate the gesture and the effort. He said that someone had chosen to help him, not because it served immediate interest, but because that person understood that strengthening one part of the network strengthens all of it. The Calthari delegation's colors shifted to warm, approving tones. They understood what he was saying on both a linguistic and conceptual level. This human was not just speaking their language, he was thinking in their patterns. Jake switched back to Common and continued his story. He explained that one simple act of generosity had set in motion a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Today, diseases that once killed millions were curable. Technologies that would have taken centuries to develop were now available across known space. Representatives of dozens of species were gathered here working together instead of competing against each other. All of this had happened because someone chose kindness over profit. He paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with as many representatives as possible. He said this was what humanity brought to the galactic community, not superior technology or military might. Not even their gift for languages, though that had proven useful enough. No, what humanity offered was a perspective that came from struggle. Humans were a young species who had barely left their home system. They had made countless mistakes and fought devastating wars. They had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times through stupidity and short-sightedness. But through all of that suffering and failure, Jake explained, humans had learned something important. They learned that their greatest strength came not from what they could take, but from what they could give. Not from building walls, but from building bridges. Not from hoarding knowledge, but from sharing it freely. These lessons had been hard-earned through centuries of conflict and cooperation, and now humanity wanted to share those lessons with the galaxy. The assembly hall was completely silent now. Every being in the room was focused on Jake and his words. He could feel the weight of their attention, and it was both terrifying and empowering. He said the Council for Interspecies Cooperation was not just another treaty organization. It was a statement about what kind of galactic civilization everyone wanted to build together. One where a desperate translator could receive help from a wealthy businessman. Where that businessman could bridge gaps between species. Where those species could come together to solve problems that would overwhelm any single civilization working alone. Jake looked directly at the Calthari delegation, and specifically at Flows Through Networks, who had been part of those first difficult negotiations years ago. The Calthari had risen to become a senior member of their government, and they responded to Jake's gaze with a complex pattern of colors that meant profound respect and recognition. They remembered those early days when Jake had helped them understand that some humans could think in biological terms and see value in mutual growth. Jake continued by saying they all stood at a threshold. Behind them was a long history of competition and isolation. Every species protecting their own interests and viewing others as potential threats or opportunities for exploitation. Before them was a possible future of cooperation and mutual growth. The choice was theirs to make as a collective. But Jake could tell them from personal experience that the rewards of choosing cooperation were greater than any of them could currently imagine. He had lived it and seen it transform not just his life, but the lives of billions. The applause started slowly at first. Just a few representatives showing their approval in whatever way their species did. But then it built into something larger. Beings who had been rivals for generations were applauding together. Species that had barely spoken to each other before were united in their response to Jake's message. It was not really about his words, he knew. It was about what those words represented, a genuine possibility for changing how the galaxy worked. After the session ended, Jake made his way through crowds of representatives who wanted to speak with him. Some had questions about SEMA and how the collaborative model worked in practice. Others wanted to share their own stories of cooperation between species. A few asked if their governments could join the initiative. Jake answered as many questions as he could, but eventually he needed to escape to a quieter corridor to catch his breath. Lancaster was waiting there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a proud smile on his face. The billionaire said it was a good speech and that Jake had done well. But then he added with a touch of his usual irony that Jake had made him sound more altruistic than he actually was. Lancaster reminded Jake that he had done everything for business reasons, not out of pure kindness. It was important not to romanticize what had happened, he said. Jake laughed and said sure, it was all just business. That was why Lancaster had just donated another 1 billion credits to the Medical Research Division last week. That was definitely just about profit and tax write-offs. Lancaster's lips twitched in amusement, and he said Jake was getting too smart for his own good. They had this conversation regularly now, this playful argument about whether Lancaster was actually a good person or just a clever businessman. The truth was probably somewhere in between. They walked together toward the observation deck where they could see Earth in the distance. The planet hung in space looking blue and beautiful and peaceful. Somewhere down there, Jake's mother was living comfortably in a nice apartment. She was healthy and surrounded by friends and living the kind of life she deserved. She had lived to see her son become one of the most important figures in galactic politics. That alone made everything worth it. Jake said quietly that he sometimes thought about what would have happened if Lancaster had just walked away that day. If the billionaire had let Jake refuse the job offer and go back to barely surviving in the cantinas, everything would be different. His mother might be dead, SEMA would not exist, the council would not be forming. Billions of beings would still be suffering from diseases that could now be cured, all because of one choice Lancaster had made. Lancaster was quiet for a moment and then said simply that he did not walk away. He made the choice to help, and that was what mattered. Jake nodded and said that because of that single choice, because one man decided to help another, everything had changed, not just for Jake and his mother, but for billions of beings across dozens of worlds. One act of kindness had created ripples that spread farther than anyone could have imagined. Lancaster looked uncomfortable with the praise and tried to deflect. He said Jake gave him too much credit. All he had done was recognize talent and give Jake the opportunity to use it properly. Jake had done all the real work, the translating and the bridge building and the diplomacy. Lancaster had just written some checks and made a few phone calls. Any rich person could have done the same thing if they had bothered to pay attention. But Jake disagreed strongly. He said Lancaster had given him something far more important than money or opportunity. He had given him hope. Hope that the universe was not just a cold, uncaring place where you struggled alone. Hope that people could choose to help each other even when there was no obvious benefit. Hope that things could get better if people were willing to work together. That was what humanity offered the galaxy, Jake explained. Not technology or wealth, but hope born from experience. Jake continued by saying humanity had been where every other species had been at some point. They had struggled and failed and suffered. They had faced extinction multiple times. They had made terrible mistakes that cost millions of lives. But through all of that, they had learned that the only way forward was together, not through dominance or competition, but through cooperation and mutual support. That was the lesson humanity could teach the galaxy because they had learned it the hard way. Lancaster smiled, a genuine smile without any of his usual ironic distance. He asked Jake if he really believed all of that. Jake said yes, absolutely. He believed it because he had lived it personally. A desperate translator had gotten help from a billionaire. That billionaire had helped bridge different species. Those species had come together to solve problems. Now they were building something unprecedented in galactic history, all because someone chose kindness over profit, even though it turned out kindness was actually more profitable anyway. Lancaster chuckled and added that yes, the profit had come anyway. It turned out that helping people was actually excellent business. Who would have thought that investing in others and building collaborative relationships would be more profitable than trying to crush everyone and hoard resources? It was almost funny how the universe worked sometimes. Do the right thing and you get rewarded for it. Over the following years, The Council for Interspecies Cooperation grew and evolved into something far more significant than anyone had initially imagined. What started as a framework for sharing technology and knowledge became the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization. Species that had been enemies for centuries found ways to work together. Ancient territorial disputes were resolved through mediation instead of warfare. Trade agreements were renegotiated to benefit all parties instead of just the strongest. Jake found himself at the center of many of these developments. His ability to understand and translate not just languages but entire worldviews made him invaluable as a mediator. When two species could not find common ground, Jake would help them see the situation from each other's perspective. When negotiations stalled over cultural misunderstandings, Jake would explain the underlying assumptions each side was making. He became known across the galaxy as the human who could build bridges where others saw only walls. SEMA continued to produce remarkable breakthroughs. The joint research teams developed treatments for dozens of previously incurable diseases. They created new materials that were stronger and lighter than anything previously known. They built energy systems that were clean and efficient and could power entire planets. Every few months brought news of another major discovery that would improve lives across multiple worlds. The collaborative model was proving itself over and over, but not everyone was happy with these changes. Some powerful individuals and corporations had built their wealth on the old competitive model. They made money by controlling resources and limiting access to knowledge. The new collaborative approach threatened their profits and their power. They began working behind the scenes to undermine the Council and SEMA, spreading rumors and funding opposition movements on various worlds. Jake became aware of these efforts when several promising collaborative projects suddenly faced unexpected political obstacles. Funding was pulled, or regulations were changed, or key personnel were reassigned. It was subtle at first, but the pattern became clear. Someone was actively trying to sabotage the cooperative initiatives and push the galaxy back toward the old ways of doing things. Jake brought his concerns to Lancaster and they discussed how to respond. Lancaster suggested they fight back with the same weapons, using money and influence to counter the opposition. But Jake disagreed. He said if they responded to sabotage with sabotage, they would prove the critics right. They would show that cooperation was just another strategy for gaining power, rather than a genuine alternative to competition. Instead, Jake proposed they respond with transparency and inclusion. They should invite the critics into the process and show them how collaboration could benefit everyone, even those who currently profited from competition. It was a risky strategy, and Lancaster was skeptical. But he trusted Jake's judgment and agreed to try it. They reached out to several of the most vocal critics and offered them positions as observers in SEMA projects. They shared financial data showing how collaborative ventures were actually more profitable than competitive ones in the long term. They invited skeptical journalists to tour research facilities and interview scientists from different species working together. The response was mixed. Some critics were won over when they saw the reality of what was happening. They realized that cooperation did not mean giving up profit or power. It meant building bigger and more sustainable sources of both. Others remained hostile and continued their efforts to undermine the initiatives. But the public relations campaign helped shift general opinion. More and more beings across the galaxy started seeing cooperation as a smart, practical choice, rather than naive idealism. Jake's mother visited him regularly now. Her health remained excellent and she had become something of a celebrity in her own right. People knew her as the woman whose illness had indirectly sparked a galactic revolution. She gave talks at medical conferences about her experience with Bennington disease and the experimental treatments. She advocated for making medical care more accessible and affordable across all worlds. She had found purpose and meaning in sharing her story. One evening, she and Jake had dinner together in a quiet restaurant on the station. She told him how proud she was of everything he had accomplished. But then she said something that surprised him. She said she was most proud of the fact that he had not let success change who he was fundamentally. He was still the kind, compassionate person who cared about others. He had not become cold or calculating despite working in the world of galactic politics. He had kept his humanity. Jake felt emotional hearing those words from his mother. He said he tried to remember where he came from and why any of this mattered. It was not about personal glory or accumulating power. It was about helping people the way Lancaster had helped him. It was about building a galaxy where fewer beings had to suffer unnecessarily. That goal kept him grounded even when he was dealing with the complexities of interspecies politics. His mother smiled and said that was exactly what she meant. She told him that his father would have been incredibly proud too. His father had believed in helping others and standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. Jake was honoring that legacy every day through his work. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. They sat together in comfortable silence, both thinking about the man who had died too young but whose values lived on. Meanwhile, Lancaster was facing challenges of his own. Some of his business partners were pressuring him to take a more aggressive stance in negotiations. They argued that he was leaving money on the table by being too generous with collaborative agreements. They wanted him to use his position and influence to ensure humans got the biggest share of benefits from SEMA. Lancaster refused, and several partners left his company in frustration. He replaced them with people who understood the long-term vision. Jake and Lancaster met regularly to discuss strategy and coordinate their efforts. Their relationship had deepened over the years into genuine friendship despite the age difference and different backgrounds. They trusted each other completely and could speak honestly, without worrying about political implications. These private conversations often revealed doubts and fears that neither man would share publicly. They supported each other through difficult decisions and celebrated successes. Together, one particularly difficult situation arose when two member species of the Council got into a serious dispute over mining rights in a contested region of space. Both sides had legitimate historical claims and both needed the resources. Traditional diplomacy was failing to find a solution, and there were fears the dispute could escalate into armed conflict. The Council asked Jake to mediate, and he knew this would be his biggest challenge yet. Jake spent weeks studying the history of both species and the specific issues involved in the dispute. He met separately with leaders from each side to understand their positions and underlying concerns. He realized that both sides were approaching the problem from a scarcity mindset, assuming there was not enough for everyone, but Jake thought there might be a way to reframe the situation using the collaborative principles that had worked so well in other contexts. He proposed that, instead of fighting over who got to mine the contested region, both species should form a joint mining operation. They would share the costs, the work, and the profits equally. More importantly, they would combine their different technologies and approaches to extract resources more efficiently than either could alone. This would actually give them access to more total resources than if one side won exclusive rights. The proposal was met with skepticism from both sides initially. They had been enemies for so long that the idea of working together seemed impossible. But Jake persisted and eventually convinced them to try a small pilot project. The pilot was successful beyond anyone's expectations. The joint operation extracted twice as many resources as projected and did so with less environmental damage. Both species made more profit than they would have from exclusive rights, and they learned valuable techniques from each other. The success of this mediation enhanced Jake's reputation even further. He was asked to help with other disputes and conflicts across the galaxy. Each successful resolution proved again that cooperation was not just morally right but practically effective. It produced better outcomes for everyone involved. The old competitive mindset started to seem not just wrong but actually stupid and inefficient. Why fight over scraps when working together could create abundance? As more species joined the Council and more collaborative projects succeeded, a tipping point was reached. Cooperation became the default approach rather than the exception. Species that tried to maintain the old competitive ways found themselves increasingly isolated. Young beings growing up in this new era could barely understand why their ancestors had spent so much time and energy fighting each other. To them, collaboration was just common sense. Jake reflected on how much had changed in such a relatively short time. 10 years ago, he had been a desperate translator barely surviving. Now he was helping to reshape galactic civilization. But the most important change was not in his personal circumstances or even in the political structures. 20 years after that fateful day in the spaceport conference room, Jake stood once again before a gathering of galactic representatives. But this time it was not the council chambers or a diplomatic session. This was a special commemoration ceremony honoring the founding of what had become known simply as the Cooperation, the informal name for the network of collaborative relationships that now connected most of the known galaxy. Jake had been asked to speak about the early days and share his perspective on how far they had all come. He looked out at the massive crowd and saw beings from over 200 different species. Some of these species had not even made contact with the larger galaxy when SEMA first started. They had been isolated on their home worlds or engaged in their own regional conflicts. Now they were all part of this vast web of cooperation and mutual support. The growth had been exponential and showed no signs of slowing. Every year brought new members and new collaborative projects. Jake began his speech by taking everyone back to that cantina where he had been translating mining contracts for barely enough money to survive. He painted a picture of desperation and exhaustion, but also of stubborn determination. He had refused to give up even when everything seemed hopeless because his mother needed him. That refusal to quit in the face of overwhelming odds was very human, he said, and it was one of the things humanity brought to the galactic community. He talked about meeting Lancaster and how skeptical he had been when the billionaire offered help. It seemed too good to be true because in Jake's experience, the universe was not kind to desperate people. But Lancaster had proven him wrong. The billionaire had chosen generosity over calculation, and that choice had changed everything. Jake emphasized that this was not about Lancaster being a saint or a hero. It was about a practical businessman recognizing that helping others was actually the smartest thing he could do. The audience listened intently as Jake described those first nervous negotiations with the Kalthari. He admitted that he had been terrified of making a mistake that would ruin humanity's chance at accessing their advanced biotechnology, but the Kalthari had responded to honesty and genuine effort to understand their perspective. They had taught him that cooperation required more than just good intentions. It required real work to bridge different ways of thinking and being. Jake shared stories from the past 2 decades, both successes and failures. There had been collaborative projects that did not work out, and species that left the cooperation after disagreements. There had been moments when it seemed like the whole experiment might collapse under the weight of too many competing interests. But every time they faced a crisis, they found a way through it by returning to the core principle of mutual benefit. If everyone gained something, conflicts could be resolved. He talked about his mother and how her recovery had been one of the first major successes of human Kalthari collaboration. That breakthrough had led to cures for hundreds of other diseases. Millions of beings across dozens of worlds were alive today because of treatments developed through cooperative research. Every one of those lives represented a family that did not have to go through what Jake had gone through. That alone made all the effort worthwhile. Jake acknowledged that the cooperation was not perfect. There were still conflicts and misunderstandings. Some species participated more enthusiastically than others. Resources were not always distributed fairly, and there were ongoing debates about how to make the system more equitable. But these problems were being addressed through dialogue and negotiation, rather than violence and domination. That was progress, even if it was messy and slow. He spoke directly to the younger beings in the audience, those who had grown up in this era of cooperation and could barely imagine the old ways. He told them not to take what they had for granted. The collaborative civilization they inherited had been built through hard work and sacrifice by many beings. It was fragile and needed to be actively maintained. Every generation would face challenges that tested their commitment to cooperation over competition. They needed to be ready to make that choice again and again. Jake's voice grew more emotional as he reached the conclusion of his speech. He said that when he looked back at that desperate young translator in the cantina, he barely recognized himself. That person had been alone and afraid and convinced the universe was indifferent to suffering. But he had been wrong. The universe was full of beings willing to help if given the chance. The key was creating structures and cultures that encouraged helping rather than exploiting each other. He finished by saying that humanity's gift to the galaxy was not any particular technology or skill. It was simply the willingness to try cooperation even when it seemed risky or naive. Humans had learned through bitter experience that fighting each other led nowhere good. They had decided to try a different way and invited others to join them. The fact that so many species had accepted that invitation and built something beautiful together was the greatest achievement of his lifetime. He thanked everyone for being part of this ongoing experiment in building a better galaxy. The applause was thunderous and lasted several minutes. Jake stepped back from the podium feeling drained but satisfied. He had said what needed to be said, and he hoped it would inspire others to continue the work. As he left the stage, Lancaster was waiting in the wings. The billionaire was much older now, his hair white and his movements slower, but his mind was still sharp and his commitment unwavering. Lancaster clapped Jake on the shoulder and said it was a fine speech. Then he added with a smile that Jake had once again made him sound better than he actually was. They both laughed because this had become a running joke between them over the years. Lancaster maintained he was just a selfish businessman who got lucky, while Jake insisted the billionaire was one of the most genuinely good people he had ever met. The truth was probably that Lancaster was both things at once. They walked together through the corridors of the station, heading toward a private reception for the founding members of SEMA. Along the way, they passed windows showing views of space filled with vessels from hundreds of worlds, trade ships and research vessels and passenger liners all moving peacefully through what had once been contested space. The visible evidence of cooperation was everywhere if you knew how to look for it. Jake asked Lancaster if he ever regretted the path they had taken. If he ever wished he had just built a traditional business empire and kept all the profits for himself instead of sharing so much with others. Lancaster stopped walking and looked at Jake with genuine surprise. He said that was possibly the stupidest question Jake had ever asked him. Of course, he did not regret it. He was richer now than he ever would have been playing the old competitive games. More importantly, he had built something that would outlast him by centuries. Lancaster continued by saying that his daughter would have been 40 years old this year if she had lived. He thought about her every day and what she might have become. He could not bring her back, but he could honor her memory by helping others live the lives she never got to have. Every person saved by cooperative medical research was a small memorial to his little girl. That mattered more to him than any amount of money ever could. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion, as it always did when Lancaster talked about his daughter. He said that she would be proud of what her father had built in her name. Lancaster nodded and they resumed walking. The reception was pleasant and filled with old friends and colleagues. Stories were shared and memories relived. Everyone present had played some role in building the cooperation, and they all understood how unlikely and precious it was. Late in the evening, Jake stepped out onto an observation deck to get some air and clear his head. His mother joined him there and they stood together looking at the stars. She was in her 80s now, but still healthy and active thanks to the treatments that had saved her life decades ago. She told Jake that she had been thinking about his father during the ceremony. She wished he could have seen what their son had accomplished and been part of this amazing time. Jake put his arm around his mother's shoulders and said his father was part of it in a way. The values his father had taught him about helping others and doing the right thing had guided everything Jake did. Every bridge he built between species and every conflict he mediated was influenced by the lessons his father had shared when Jake was young. His father lived on through those values and through the civilization they were helping to create. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, mother and son together at the end of a long and eventful journey. Jake thought about that desperate young man in the cantina all those years ago. That person had been so focused on just surviving the next day that he could not imagine any kind of future. He certainly could not have imagined this, standing on a station with his healthy mother, having helped reshape galactic civilization, surrounded by friends and colleagues from dozens of worlds. His mother squeezed his hand and said quietly that she was grateful for every single day. Grateful that she had lived to see all of this and grateful for the strange series of events that had led them here. She said that sometimes the universe did take care of people, but only if people were willing to take care of each other first.